Eric Berlin, an alum from the Saltonstall Foundation, lives near Syracuse, New York, and is teaching online for the Poetry School. His poems have won the National Poetry Prize 2015 and Ledge 2014 Poetry Prize. His poems have also appeared in North American Review, Jewish Currents, Stone Canoe, and the Poetry Review, among others. Eric received an MFA in sculpture from the New York Academy of Art, an MFA in poetry from Syracuse University, and a BA in English from Harvard University. Eric is working on several writing projects, including a book on the musicality of language in world religions, and his first manuscript of poems, a finalist for the Levis Prize, is currently under revision and nearing completion, which we look forward to. Please give a warm welcome to Eric Berlin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for coming. Without Saltonstall Foundation, I wouldn't have written the last group of poems that I put together there about a year ago. The last spell of productivity I had was there. Constance Saltonstall created this foundation for all kinds of artists who struggle to find time. And thank you for making time today also to come down and hear Chen's work and some of mine too. This first poem is called Threshold. The bones my father owned, he locked inside a closet none of us could open. God knows who he bought them from, with cotton wads for eyes and springs that gave the teeth their bite. From underneath its frosted plastic shroud, the skull showed clear, and also where the ribs bowed outward, but the rest was mostly hidden. And where the spiky toes hung down, we'd crouch on the threshold, sorting through the loose change he'd shoved all year between carpet and door. We'd turn all the pennies' heads to the floor, and the ones with sheaves of wheat would get saved, but the worthless ones, the rest of the heap, would get stacked and stuffed into paper sleeves. I asked him recently where that skeleton came from. He's a doctor, so it was labeled with red and blue for the origins and insertions of the muscles, and it was a strange ritual that he sort of had us do through childhood, sorting out the wheat pennies from the other pennies. He told me he got it in Canada, and I said, so is there someone who donated their body to science? And he said, no, I think it was from Vietnam. And I'm hoping at some point to return it, because it's strange to have grown up with a man in the vestibule, a real person, who I'm sure didn't want to end up in suburban New Jersey. This next piece is also, these first three poems are about him as a doctor, my childhood growing up with a father who was a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon. This is called The Binding, and it takes its title from the story about Abraham and Isaac, which always struck me as strange, especially now that I have a child of my own, to put anything over your own child. It just seems so unholy. So, The Binding. Oh, and code black, I guess, is the condition when all the beds are full in the hospital. He'll laugh when asked years later for details, although my memory is sharp to the point where I fumbled down the ladder from my bunk wheezing, turned the clear glass knob to their bedroom, the panic in my mother's voice undisguised, the cold O of his stethoscope on my chest. Last thing I saw was a branch like a wishbone dangling as he laid me across the back seat. Then the night rolled away as they ran every light between home and the ER, where the nurses apologized, the residents all tied up with code black, and in the absence of any higher authority, my dad saw his son turn cerulean blue. And just an intern himself, who mainly knew bones, counted down the 6 hard rings of the trachea. No angel seized his wrist as he lifted the lancet, which he'd already unwrapped, although that he couldn't recall having done, and caressed the pit of my neck so the flesh would split, and with 2 tiny claws he could hold back the sides for the tube he'd insert, so at last he could breathe for me. This was the poem where I decided not to become a doctor. It's called Legacy. Although I wish I had those superpowers now that I'm a father. I trailed my dad downstairs into the morgue. The man whose leg he had them save for us was watching cartoons on the second floor. Above the knee they'd sliced it flush, the bone dull white, the meat all burgundy. Poised in my fingers like a fine paintbrush, the lightweight knife he used in surgery flashed its singular purpose. A faint hush fell as I traced a slow line down the calf. The skin divided smooth as cellophane. He nodded me on, but I stepped away to breathe behind a pillar, and he laughed. Fresh air? Gently taking his scalpel back. His fingertips dry, his cuticles cracked. I don't think my dad shows up in any more poems. Okay, Night Errand. Oh, great northern mall, you dwindling oracle of upstate New York. Your colossal lot of frost-heaved spaces so vacant I could cut straight through while blinking and keep my eyes shut. I've come like the flies that give up the ghost at the papered fronts of your defunct stores. Through the food court where napkins, unused to touch, are packed too tight to be dispensed. Past the pimpled kid manning the register who stares at the buttons and wipes his palms. If I press my eyes until checkers rise from the dark, that's how the overheads glower in home essentials as I roam through Sears seeking assistance. I know you're here. For this window crank I brought, you show me a muted wall of TVs where Jeff Goldblum picks his way through the splintered remains of a dinosaur crate. There must be 50 of him, hunching over mud to inspect the three-toed prints. I almost didn't come in here at all, driving the opposite of victory laps, and waiting as I hoped for the red to leave my eyes. But my urgency smacked of your nothingness. I did it again. I screamed at the woman I love, and in front of our 1-year-old, who covered his ears. There's a series of poems I did about objectification. Part of my fascination with death is like in art school, the difference between physical matter and living matter, and how we become just matter at some point too. And the challenge of filling your materials with some kind of energy. So I started to explore the concept of what gets objectified, and the amputated leg was one of those. This is another part of that series about objectification, and in the process I kind of explore my muse, which I think having a muse is sort of objectifying your source of inspiration. This is called Harvest Fair on Columbus Ave, and it happened around Thanksgiving time a couple years ago. Christened with pigeon shit, Columbus unclenches the nautical charts, the moth-eaten parchment that brought him this far, and regards the Caribbean palm trees and beaches from a column of concrete too short to conceal how his chin streaked with rivulets. The rabble that swarm now through these streets, unroused by soft pretzels and free Pepto-Bismol, hardly look up, half aghast, half enthralled instead with the jester in clashing plaids, whose tossing balls of ruby hues reverse cascading easily, 5, which shifts to 7, as I start to sense how it's the air, not the balls, that's incandescent. And when to that flurry of twirling he adds 2 more, locking 9 of those balls into furious symmetry, I see through the blur to the far end of the circle, a girl disabled, her knees to one side, her chin to the other, racked by an illness I'd be wrong to guess, like it's wrong to stare. But no one can tell I'm no longer watching this waste of grace I wouldn't have stopped flipping channels to see. I'm tracing the chords of her twisted neck as she takes in the sky, not the stretch that's bronzed by the setting sun, but the east, from which the darkness comes. All right. Suicide Prevention Awareness Day was pretty recently, so I thought I'd read this. A friend of mine took his life about 6 years ago, and this is about a prank email he sent me. He was hilarious, and his mother instilled in him a dark sense of humor when he was learning to drive in Boston. As a teenager, she drove him down to the docks at night. She said, "Okay, honey, you get around and I'll scoot over." And when he got out, she locked the doors. And she had arranged with a friend of hers to wear like a rubber wolf mask. And they came out and chased him around the car. When he describes it, he said he was running so fast he caught up with the guy. He was a hilarious guy, and it was a huge loss. And this was one of the lesser pranks that he played, but looking back on it, it takes on a more ominous tone. And I realized it's sort of, for me, it's the Green Knight showing up in the court, kind of like a supernatural presence. It's called The Same. Excuse me. The Same. When the guard's flashlight peters out in my bag and a few good smacks don't knock the batteries back into proper alignment, he waves me on for passing his test of my patience. And it's only as I'm heading towards the cavernous reading room that I see the light return half-heartedly to the palm he's cupped over the bulb. More out of boredom, it seems, than any desire to have it work again, because no one should be indoors on a day like today when the petrified lions out front are the only cool things to touch, and the whole hall is sticky with silence, a swarm with the steady breath of thousands bent to the light of separate lamps, feeding on information from their thick wood chairs. My laptop feels like a cool slab of flagstone set down on the spot I claimed for myself, and I'm about to start work when I notice an email my friend Sean sent. Can you find 3 differences in the pictures below? Side by side they fade in. 2 snow-capped peaks, 2 black rivers snaking through 2 verdant canyons, the same small boat rounding the same bend, the same fishing village surrounded by footpaths that branch out the same, leading down to the exact same strip of gray sand. When the split in the screen disappears, and the same sort of shriek that you'd hear in the cabin as your plane goes down, not the sound of a human scream, but the visceral wail of the vibrating walls blasts from my speakers. A grisly beard that a grimace splits into fangs appears, and a gasp like a shockwave sweeps the hall with chairs screeching out, papers slammed down, and all heads in the room turning towards me, the source of this howl, their cud hanging mid-chew, beaming disgust, and I'm smacking the keys for the volume, the mute, this demon still screaming from between dark curtains of knotted green locks, until at last I slammed the screen down and slipped the whole thing in my bag. The head in my laptop burnt in my brain, the nostrils flaring on hundreds of faces, such absolute loathing, and over an accident. That email has last before the closed casket. Let me see. Okay. This is another take on objectification. If you've gone to Hollywood and you know the Walk of Fame with all the stars in the sidewalk, and then beyond that near the theater, there's the footprints and handprints of celebrity. I was excited to find the Marx Brothers, all the 4 important ones, or the 3 important ones in the extra one. But Harpo was the most interesting to me, and he was the silent one for those of you who aren't familiar with the Marx Brothers, but a genius. And his brother Groucho was actually admired by T.S. Eliot, and regretted not becoming a writer in some ways. But anyway, so I found Harpo's hands, and it was a thrill, because he was so nonverbal, to actually touch where his hands were. I think it was just a physical, felt like a connection. So this is about that bizarre scene, because there's the history, but then there's also people dressed up in costumes, Smurfs, Wolverine. I don't know. There's like all this random opportunities to take your picture. So this is called Impressions on Hollywood. Just off the Walk of Fame, I stooped to feel the signatures of stars, the sidewalk squares where a finger once swept through wet cement in the shape of a name hardened now for ages, and finding the polished hollows of Harpo's hands, I kneel without a word to press my palms to the cavities as if I could assume his character by slipping into the space he filled, like the chill that dwells in a baseball mitt, the wedges between the fingers snug against the webbing of my hand, as some memory of his becomes mine. Unwanted urchin from Manhattan, stealing a view of the game from a hill outside the polo grounds, the only part not obscured by grandstands, reading the rest through the subtle shifts in the left fielder's posture, who punches his glove, leans on his knees, then tips his cap back as a foul leaves the field. Like an understudy peering from the wings, he learned from the body itself, most honest when forgotten, and voiceless as these costumed men along the boulevard who charge tourists $5 per picture. Spider-Man knows his swagger won't show in still photographs. A transformer smokes with his head off. My brother once from an office window spotted Chewbacca being cuffed and head-palmed into a squad car. Many, he says, are ex-cons who can't land better work when they finally get out. There's a couple I'm almost close enough to overhear as I leave, a man and woman almost half my height, finished with other people's make-believe, wiping their blue necks clean with handkerchiefs. This one is about a painting I had a staring contest with. And it was a self-portrait that Van Gogh did that I became very interested in. He depicts himself as a Buddhist monk, and it's for that reason I chose to do this as a Japanese form, a renga, which is normally a social composition collaboration where you pass it around and you do a haiku and a little bit and repeat that 18 times. So I did that as a group of selves. And I took the epigraph from the letters that Van Gogh wrote to his brother. Someone has a great fire in his soul, and nobody ever comes to warm themselves at it, and passers-by see nothing but a little smoke at the top of the chimney, and then go on their way. When my friend's boyfriend's mother died of a tumor, there were umpteen cards in the sympathy section to choose between, and one said, "It's hard to find words." A line I could have written for $4.99. But the front had that painting by Van Gogh, that cobalt blue, the most expensive of the tubes his brother sent to support his work. Iris blossoms fluttering like a moth in different states of flight, and I bet you'd recognize the image. In some hotel rooms, they'll hang two of the same print, one over each of the beds. Or maybe you know if you saw it in person and checked the small plaque, how he'd paint in the garden of St. Remy's Asylum. The jaded watchman at the threshold to the next room of landscapes stared as I leaned toward the picture, but kept a mannered distance. How this man became iconic of unyielding devotion to light, his ravenous eyes wolfing down the flowers before him, is no mystery. Just look at those irises, the ones in his eyes, in this portrait of himself as a monk with shaven head, his lids Japanesed, a bow to Hiroshige, whose sudden downpour he'd copied as a student, enthralled with the quiet work of the knife that kept carving as peasants bolted over the footbridge and the boatman leaned harder on his pole to get to shore. Using the same stroke he'd use for a field of wheat along his bristling jaw, around the cranial curve, the part of the head that's safe to treat as a thing. He arrives at his own eyes, ablaze with distrust. And when you sit for hours to study how the lamplight breaks across your brow, the bridge of your nose, you might be surprised how long it takes, not just to trace the parts, but to be seen by yourself. The eye that looks back, whichever one you try to pin down will slightly shift to consider itself. So you end up having two disconnected eyes, each squinting through the mask of who you think you are. A backdrop of emerald radiating from his head, obliterates, but only in part, the letters "A mon ami, Paul." This gift he made of himself, then chose to give to himself. I once met a man who had played Jesus on stage, and he said how strange it felt after the curtain to be watched in the lobby by the audience, and how no one would talk to him or return his gaze, how empty the moonlit roads, how desolate the bike ride home. One detail I should have mentioned was he had dedicated that to Paul Gauguin, and then he like, nah, he crossed it up. I think I went over, so I want that to be my last poem. And I want to hand things over to you, Chen. And thank you all for being here. I'm excited to